Hi students, in this video I'm going to talk about the Protestant Reformation, the origins of the Protestant Reformation, and Martin Luther. So last week we looked at the Age of Exploration. We looked at how European influence was expanding and growing across the world. And in this week, and in the weeks to come, we're going to look at a split in European culture, in a split in Christian identity, which up until this point, since the fall of Rome, had been a big part of what united European culture. And this split in Christian identity that's brought about by the Protestant Reformation is driven by and also furthers a couple of trends that we're also looking at in this class. One is government power. Local governments, political rulers are becoming more powerful. And that both supports the Protestant Reformation and the Protestant Reformation supports it. And also that individuals are emphasizing their autonomy more and more. And again, this is something that the Protestant Reformation both encourages and is influenced by. So first, by way of introduction, we'll talk about the state of the medieval church, the late medieval church, as we come to the end of the 15th century, as we come to the year 1500. The medieval papacy had seen a lot of successes. It had evangelized most of Europe after the fall of Rome. It had established itself as the leader of Christianity, the unchallenged leader of Christianity, certainly in Western Europe. Nevertheless, in the 14th and the 15th centuries, we see that papal authority is weakened. It's weakened by the fact that the popes are captured and basically held in prison by the French rulers in France for 50, 60 years. Popes start to be seen as puppets of the French rulers, not as representatives of God. Then there's the Great Western Schism, in which you have two different and at one point 3 different men all claiming to be Pope. And this really confuses the issue. And you have to work out who is the real Pope, who are the real bishops that they're nominating all across the church. And if you're not sure and all the clergy are fighting with one another, who do you turn to? Typically, you start to turn to the king. And so at the same time as the medieval papacy is becoming weaker, kings and rulers, secular rulers, are becoming more powerful. Then in the 15th century, we enter into the period of the Renaissance, period during which the papacy is trying to regain control of its lands in Rome. For justifiable reasons, it feels that it needs these lands in order to be independent and not be influenced by different governments. But doing so makes the popes into rival Italian princes and politicians. And this really weakens the authority of the papacy. And so we see that prior to the Reformation, prior to the Protestant Reformation, many people across Europe had seen the need for church reform without seeing the need for breaking away from the church. That was what made Martin Luther revolutionary. Lots of people at the time thought the church needed reforming. But Martin Luther was the first one to accept breaking away from the church and, if you will, establishing his own church hierarchy. So let's talk a little bit about Martin Luther. He's someone who comes from, in the PowerPoint, I'd say a middle-class background. His father was a miner. His father worked hard to provide young Martin with an education. Nevertheless, at a certain point in his life, he's caught out in a storm, thinks that he's going to die. He promises God that if he survives, he will become a monk. And so he becomes a monk because of his advanced educational training. He rises pretty quickly through the order in which he joins, becomes more and more responsible, but at the same time, he's undergoing real spiritual crises, 2 spiritual crises. One is he becomes obsessed with his own sinfulness and starts to doubt that even God can forgive his sins. And at the same time, he starts to be influenced by the philosophy of nominalism. Now, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here about the philosophy of nominalism. It's not a philosophy class. But boiled down to it, nominalism said, or the impact of nominalism, the end result of following nominalism, is to argue that we cannot reason to God's existence. Medieval philosophers, and especially the dominant medieval philosophy that we call scholasticism, had been pretty confident that God can be understood through reason. Even that we can work up to understanding or to proving that God exists through reason. And nominalists disagreed with this. They said that God is all-powerful. You can't put God in a box, in the box of human reason. God isn't subject to human laws. You can't know God through human laws or even through nature's laws. And so these are the crises that Martin Luther is wrestling with, and they shape his theology, or the three fundamental pillars of his theology. He begins from the premise that human nature is evil and depraved. So this is coming from his own obsession about his own sinfulness. And God can overlook man's evilness, but he can't take away human depravity. He can only cover it. So this is the only way that human beings can be saved. They can only be saved by believing that the grace of God will cover over their sins. And so these are the first two premises, the first two foundations of Luther's theology. Only through faith, not through anything that human beings can do because their nature is radically depraved. Only through faith and only through God's grace. The last pillar is only through the scriptures. That because human nature is so radically depraved, because human nature is so evil, we cannot come to a knowledge of God through our own reason, but only through reading the scriptures. And so this is the influence of nominalism and Luther's own concern about his sinfulness coming together. And so these are the theological ideas that Luther starts to develop before any sort of overt rebellion against the Catholic Church. But he does rebel in 1517 because the papacy is promoting the practice of indulgences. Now, one of the videos that I've assigned for this week gives you a really good sense of this church teaching on indulgences, which is pretty complex. But suffice it to say that for Luther, an indulgence, the practice of doing a particular good work or a particular prayer, and in turn earning some time off purgatory. Again, I'm grossly oversimplifying it. You need to watch the video to fully understand it, or to get a fuller understanding. Definitely won't fully understand it. For Luther, that's human works. That's human works, and the papacy is telling you what you can do and how much temporal punishment, how much time in purgatory you'll be able to mark off. And so for Luther, this goes against the idea of sola scriptura, because it's the authority of the papacy, and it goes against these ideas of only by faith and only by grace, because it's being done through the works of a sinful human being. And so he openly rebels against the church. He starts publishing his own theology, condemning the papacy, condemning the hierarchy of the church. And unlike previous dissident groups against the church, he's able to spread these ideas much more quickly because of the printing press. So the individualism that's present in society, the growing power of political rulers and secular governments is crucial to the success of the Protestant Reformation. But the fact that the printing press has been developed it helps a lot as well. And so Luther has started to make a noise. He started to become a nuisance to the Catholic Church. And so he's summoned to appear before the Catholic Emperor Charles V. Charles V, who was a committed Catholic and ruled over an enormous empire that included Holy Roman Empire territories in Germany, but also the Kingdom of Spain and all the Spanish Empire in the New World that we talked about previously. And Charles V questions Luther. And you can see the different Catholic and Protestant approaches in their debate. Charles V says to Luther, if you are right, that means for 1,500 years, Catholics have been getting it wrong. or somehow God has been failing to get the message to Catholics. And Charles said, I'm not going to trust your own reading of the Bible against the history and the traditions of the church and the authority of the bishops, that you need the authority of the bishops, you need the expertise of the bishops, you need Jesus's guarantees that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church. You need all of these in order to understand how to live a Christian life. But for Luther, it's much more simple than that. For Luther, it's about an individual approach to religion and a rejection of intermediaries like popes and cardinals and bishops. Luther says, unless you can prove this to me through the Bible to my own satisfaction, I'm not interested. And so Luther refuses to reject his teachings and is sentenced to be imprisoned as a heretic. While he's on his way to being imprisoned, he is kidnapped in dramatic scenes by masked horsemen, and his kidnapping actually turns out to be very good for Luther, because the person who's behind his kidnapping is a local German ruler who's a rival of Charles V. Not that he has anything approaching Charles's power, but he wants to be independent of Charles V. And so he kidnaps Luther in order to rescue him, in order to give him somewhere to hide, in order to give him somewhere to develop his theology, in order to give his theology time to spread. And this is what happens. Hiding away under the protection of Frederick of Saxony, no one knows where Luther's gone for a number of months. Luther continues to develop his theology and to reject other aspects of Catholic theology, including Catholic sacraments, including the Catholic hierarchy of priests and bishops. And people in the German-speaking parts of Europe start to embrace Luther's ideas. And they start, and people start to adopt these ideas across the empire. And Charles V, although he wants to put a stop to this, simply doesn't have the time. He's being attacked by the King of France. He's helping to defend Austria against an invasion from the Ottoman Turks. And these seem to be more immediately important things. Charles doesn't know that this is going to be a Christian split that exists even down to this day. And so Charles deals with these things. And then by the time he comes to dealing with Luther, there's not really much he can do about it. He can defeat Protestant rulers who are defying him, but he can't totally subdue them. And so he has to come to a peace treaty, Treaty of Augsburg in 1555. And as a part of this treaty, the principle is agreed that the religion of the local ruler, or the religion of the ruler, will be the official religion of the region. And so this is basically a band-aid. You can probably already see where this is going to go wrong, but this will bring the war to an end for the moment. The different regions of the Holy Roman Empire will determine which form of Christianity they're going to follow and promote based on the religion of their ruler. And so here you can see the rise and continued rise in power of governments and of rulers that's so crucial to the Protestant Reformation being successful. Okay, enjoy learning about the Protestant Reformation, and I'll see you soon.